The Soybean School on realagriculture.com is brought to you by Pride Seeds, Safina Insecticide, and Cruiser Max Vibrance Beans.
Welcome to Real Agriculture Soybean School Series. I'm Kara Oosterhuis. In this episode, I talked to John Gawlowski, who's an entomologist with Manitoba Agriculture. John and I talk about grasshoppers. Now, we all know grasshoppers like to eat your cereals. However, we talk about them eating your soybeans. So we talk about going out and scouting for them and what exactly damage looks like in your soybean fields.
So we're in a soybean field and right near a field edge. I've been getting a lot of questions recently on grasshoppers, and it's right now mid-June, and people are asking, what are the grasshoppers like stage-wise, and is it too early to be controlling them? Because in a lot of cases, people are seeing a lot of grasshoppers on their field edges, and they don't know, is it too early for me to be spraying? So we're going to address that question, and then talk a little bit about grasshoppers and the species we've got, and what tends to drive their populations. So first of all, grasshoppers. Now, to put things in perspective, not every grasshopper is and behaves the same. We've got about 180 species of grasshoppers in Canada, and there's 4 species we consider to be pests here in the prairies. So there's a lot of non-pest species. That's another topic we can do another time, but we'll focus on the 4 pest ones. They all have the same type of life cycle, where when they start out, when they're young, they're about the size of a wheat kernel. They've got no true wings or functional wings that they can fly with. They're in the ditches. Wherever there was lush green vegetation late last summer, whether it was a pasture, an alfalfa field, field edge, a ditch, that's where the eggs are going to be laid, and that's where these kind of wheat kernel-sized grasshoppers emerge when they first come out. Now, they go through 5 stages before they get their wings, become an adult, and can actually fly into the fields. Only when they're an adult do they have fully functional wings and can fly. We'll get into this stage probably at some point in July, mid to late July. You get a lot of winged grasshoppers. That's when they can really invade the field. Now's a great time to be looking for grasshoppers, because if there is a lot, and you can determine that when they're still in these young stages, you can control them before they've really invaded the field. And sometimes just doing an edge spray is all you need to be doing. So it's good to have a look at what you've got and the different stages of them. The crops can take a lot of feeding. In fact, soybeans, the crop we're in here, you can get up to 40% defoliation, and the plants will still do quite fine. So we do have a little bit of grasshopper feeding here, but some people do get freaked out by this, but this leaf here, you're looking at probably 10%, 15% of that leaf defoliated. These 2 little holes will do next to nothing. That leaf will still grow quite well. A little bit more on this leaf here. That's probably getting up around 1/4 to 1/3 of the leaf being eaten. But even that is below what we consider the economic threshold in soybeans. Soybeans are very robust and can tolerate quite a bit of feeding. So this one here is a bit bigger. Just grab him by the leg. So this one again is a little bit bigger, and you can see that it is starting to get these little pads on its wings. Now, when most of your grasshoppers are getting to this size here, that's a good time to be spraying.
When in the growing season would you actually treat a crop for grasshoppers?
Usually it's late June, early July when we're doing the ditches and the edges. Again, because most of them are now into those 3rd, 4th instar stages. So now would be a little bit early, and again, right now it's mid-June, and there's still a lot of egg hatch to happen. By late June, early July, most of that hatch is done, and you can treat the field and probably not have to do it a second time unless you have them reinvading from other areas. If anybody is noticing a lot of defoliation early on from the grasshoppers moving in from the edges, and you do want to treat before peak egg hatch, use something with a long residual. That way you will get control once those remaining grasshoppers hatch out and start moving in. There are foliar insecticides with a bit long residual. There's also brand baits you can buy and apply to the field edges. So either option works quite well.
What kind of research is there around thresholds with grasshoppers?
Thresholds are very tough with grasshoppers. So I mentioned there's different types of grasshoppers, And when you're scouting, you have to be careful not to include some of the non-pest ones in your counts, and we'll go over those in a minute. But when you're scouting for grasshoppers, the proper way to do it would be to walk into a ditch or a field and just start kicking the vegetation and trying to count grasshoppers as they hop as you're kicking the vegetation. So it's actually a bit of a tricky thing to do. As you're doing these walks, focus on an area about 1 meter square in front of you and about 5 paces in front of you. And as you walk towards that area and you get to the area, again, count the number of grasshoppers walking through that area. Now, when you do your next count, don't keep going in a straight line. Turn and go on an angle, because as you walk, you're moving the grasshoppers in front of you. And if you just keep going in a straight line, you'll be forcing all those grasshoppers in front of you. So do a count and then turn and move the other way and count what's jumping in the ditch or in front of you. And the same thing when you're walking through a crop. If you're in a wheat crop, or could be wheat, canola, lentils, whatever. If you're doing meter square assessments, walk in, do an assessment, turn on an angle, do another count. So almost a W pattern, just so you're not kind of counting grasshoppers that you've forced in front of you. Okay, so as a general guideline, 8 to 12 grasshoppers per meter square is what we often use in field crops. It's a nominal general threshold. Nominal threshold means we don't have a lot of great studies to back this up, but based on experience and a lot of anecdotal information, 8 to 12 per meter square is the threshold we tend to go with. We use higher numbers when the grasshoppers are young, and especially in a ditch area like this. So if you're getting 25 plus in a ditch area early on per meter square, that's a fairly heavy population, and you probably usually need to be controlling that. When you look at grasshopper economic thresholds, we usually give you tables that say 8 to 12, usually spray, 4 to 8, sometimes spray. These are very vague, broad categories. With grasshoppers, a lot depends on the stage of the crop, how vigorously it's growing, and also how vigorous the roadside vegetation is. If we have a year where we've got a lot of rain, there's a lot of lush green vegetation, 8 to 12 per meter square might not be economical. In a drier year, it might be. So that's why we often say spray may be required versus always required. Usually when you're above 12 per meter square, it's usually always required. 8 to 12, it may or may not be, again, depending on the conditions. Another thing to note, right now there's a lot of lush green vegetation in the ditches. This is where the grasshoppers would prefer to be feeding, not in here right now. That might not be so lush later in the summer, and there might be reasons why for the grasshoppers it's more enticing to be in the field. So that's something to keep an eye on. The other thing is sometimes people will cut their ditches. And if we're having a bad grasshopper year and you go and you cut your ditches, keep an eye on what happens in your field. You may be kind of forcing those grasshoppers into the field to feed.